I always thought the graveyard shift at the old gas station off Route 22 was a kind of purgatory, a place where time stretched endlessly and the world around me felt like a forgotten shadow. The pay wasn't much, but it was quiet, and the isolation suited me, at least until the night I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. It started around 2 a.m. when the flickering overhead lights began their usual dance, casting eerie shadows across the shelves of chips and candy. The station's old radio, which hadn't worked in months, crackled faintly, spitting out static punctuated by what sounded like distant whispers. I shrugged it off as interference, but a gnawing unease began to creep up my spine. It wasn't the first strange thing to happen here. For weeks, I had noticed oddities. Milk cartons turning up in the snack aisle, footprints on the freshly mopped floor, and the faint sound of shuffling feet when no one was around. But that night, the oddities escalated. As I sat behind the counter, scrolling absent-mindedly on my phone, a loud thud came from the storage room in the back. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Grabbing the flashlight from under the counter, I slowly made my way to the door. The handle was cold, unnaturally so, and as I opened it, the beam of light swept across the room. At first, I saw nothing but the neatly stacked boxes of supplies. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a shadow darting behind the shelves. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I stepped inside, feeling the oppressive silence weigh on me like a lead blanket. The smell hit me next, something rancid and metallic, like decaying meat mixed with iron. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before stabilizing. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched in the far corner, its back turned to me. It was humanoid but wrong in every conceivable way. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, and its head tilted unnaturally, as if listening to something only it could hear. My breath caught in my throat as it began to rise, its movements jerky and disjointed like a marionette being yanked by unseen strings. I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. Just a smooth, featureless expanse of flesh where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. My scream caught in my throat as it took a step toward me, its head tilting again as if studying me. I bolted out of the storage room, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead, static buzzing faintly in my ear. Suddenly, the radio came alive again, the static forming words that sent chills down my spine. "You can't leave." I turned toward the front door, only to find it locked, though I had never touched the latch. The windows, which usually offered a view of the empty highway, now reflected nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to pulse and writhe. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. It didn't mimic my movements. It smiled when I wasn't smiling. I backed away, my legs trembling, and nearly tripped over the mop bucket. That's when the whispers started again, louder this time, surrounding me like a sinister chorus. They weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were everywhere. "Join us," they hissed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice. The lights flickered violently, and when they stabilized, the figure from the storage room was standing in the middle of the store, its head cocked to one side. I couldn't breathe as it took slow, deliberate steps toward me. I retreated until my back hit the counter, and then it stopped, just a few feet away. It raised one of its grotesquely elongated arms and pointed at me. "You've been chosen," the whispers said in unison, though the creature itself didn't speak. The temperature dropped sharply, and frost began to creep across the windows and floor. My body felt heavy, my limbs refusing to obey as the figure closed the distance between us. Just as it reached out to touch me, the lights went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. When they flickered back on, the figure was gone, but the store was in complete disarray. Shelves overturned, products scattered across the floor, and the glass of the freezer doors shattered. I ran to the front door, which was now unlocked, and burst outside into the cold night air. The highway was eerily silent, and my car, parked just a few feet away, was covered in what looked like deep claw marks. I didn't wait to investigate. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station receded into the distance, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing, featureless eyes staring at me from the darkness of the back seat. The last thing I remember was the car swerving off the road and a voice whispering, "You can never leave." Working the late shift at the Cedar Ridge gas station always felt like stepping into another world, one cut off from the natural flow of time. The gas station sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, miles away from the nearest town, a lone beacon of fluorescent light surrounded by darkness so thick it felt alive. The isolation used to comfort me. It was quiet, uneventful, but over time, the silence became suffocating. Tonight, that silence felt heavier, oppressive, as if the darkness outside was watching, waiting. It started with a customer, a man who came in around midnight. He was tall and lanky, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to bore into you. He didn't say a word, just walked slowly through the aisles, his boots scraping against the tiled floor. I offered my usual polite, "Let me know if you need anything," but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head just enough to glance at me, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He purchased nothing, leaving the store without a sound, but something about him lingered, like the faint odor of gasoline and smoke that hung in the air long after he disappeared into the night. An hour passed before I heard it, the faint tapping on the glass window at the front of the store. My stomach clenched as I looked up from my phone, expecting to see a bird or maybe a branch swaying in the wind, but there was nothing. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, and I swore I saw a shadow flicker just beyond the glow of the parking lot lights. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The lot was empty, save for my car and the dimly lit pumps. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I told myself it was nothing, a raccoon, maybe, and went back inside. That's when I saw it. A note on the counter that hadn't been there before. The paper was yellowed, as if it had been aged in the sun, and the words scrawled across it in uneven handwriting sent a chill down my spine. "We see you." My pulse quickened as I scanned the store, but there was no one. The door hadn't chimed, and the security cameras showed nothing but static. I checked the storage room and even the restroom, but everything was empty. Shaking off the unease, I tried to focus on restocking shelves, but every little noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, felt amplified, each sound carrying a sinister undertone. The hours dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang. It startled me so badly I nearly dropped the box of chips I was holding. The line was filled with static, but underneath it, I could hear faint breathing. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The breathing stopped, replaced by a soft chuckle that made my skin crawl. Then the line went dead. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. That's when I noticed the man from earlier standing at pump 3. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the store. My heart raced as I locked the door, but when I looked back, he was gone. The security feed flickered to life, showing a distorted image of the parking lot. There he was, standing just out of frame, his face barely visible in the edge of the camera's range. And then he wasn't. The screen cut to black, and the lights in the store began to flicker. Desperation clawed at me as I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, the flickering casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. I backed up against the counter, clutching a wrench I had found in the storage room earlier. A loud crash came from the back of the store, followed by the sound of glass shattering. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the sound, my makeshift weapon raised. The freezer door was shattered, shards of glass glinting on the floor, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused it. I was about to turn back when I heard my name whispered, faint and breathy, as if carried by the wind. I spun around, but the store was empty. Then I saw it. Another note, this time on the freezer door. Run. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the aisles. That's when I saw the figures. At first, they were just shadows, barely distinguishable from the darkness. But as my light swept over them, they took shape, humanoid but wrong. Their features were distorted, their movements unnatural, like puppets on frayed strings. They surrounded me, their whispers filling the air with incomprehensible words that seemed to vibrate in my skull. I screamed, swinging the wrench wildly, but it passed through them as if they weren't there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they merged into a single voice that spoke directly into my mind. You will join us. The darkness closed in, and the last thing I remember was the sound of the door chime and the feeling of cold hands gripping my arms. When I woke up, it was morning. The store was immaculate. No shattered glass, no notes, no signs of the terror I had endured. My manager scolded me for leaving the store unlocked and the lights on, but I couldn't explain what had happened. The security footage showed nothing unusual, just me pacing the aisles and talking to myself. I quit that day, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of Cedar Ridge. In those dreams, I'm back in the store, and the shadows are waiting, whispering, "We see you." Working the overnight shift at Pine Hollow gas stop was supposed to be uneventful, maybe even boring, but it always carried an air of unease. It wasn't just the desolation of the place. A lone station nestled on the side of a deserted highway surrounded by dense pine woods, or the flickering, buzzing overhead lights that never seemed to fully illuminate the lot. It was the way the place felt alive after midnight, as though the shadows stretched a little longer, the air grew colder, and the quiet held its breath, waiting. I had grown used to the weird vibes, chalking them up to sleep deprivation and my overactive imagination. But one night everything changed, and I can never forget it. It started with the subtle sense that I wasn't alone, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. Around 1 a.m., I was restocking the shelves with candy bars and chips when I felt the distinct prickle of being watched. Glancing up, I saw nothing but the empty aisles and the faint reflection of the store's interior in the glass windows. Still, the sensation didn't fade. Every now and then, I would hear soft creaks or faint rustling, but I told myself it was just the old building settling or the wind against the windows. That was until I noticed something out of place. A single can of soda, standing upright in the middle of the floor where I knew there hadn't been one before. My stomach churned as I bent down to pick it up, scanning the aisles again. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I'd just forgotten dropping it there earlier. But deep down, I knew better. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence like a knife, and I almost dropped the can in surprise. The caller ID showed nothing but a blank screen. "Hello," I answered hesitantly, my voice barely steady. There was no response, only static at first. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, just loud enough to make out words. "Don't turn around." My blood turned to ice, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, despite the warning. The store was empty, at least as far as I could see, but that sensation of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking as I scanned the room, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't, not yet. I needed this job as much as I hated it. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank, a bored kid messing with me from a blocked number. I forced myself to stay busy, sweeping the floors, organizing the shelves, doing anything to keep my mind off the eerie events. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were boring into me from somewhere just out of sight. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., a car pulled into the lot. I felt an odd mix of relief and apprehension. I hadn't seen a customer all night. The vehicle was an old, beat-up sedan with its headlights dimmed. It idled there for what felt like forever, the driver hidden in shadow. Finally, the door opened, but no one stepped out. My heart pounded as I watched, waiting for something, anything to happen. The door closed again, and the car slowly backed up before driving away, disappearing into the darkness. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just some lost traveler unsure whether they wanted to stop. But then I saw it. A single handprint smeared across the glass door of the station, fresh and glistening under the fluorescent lights. It hadn't been there moments before. My chest tightened as I locked the door, my hands fumbling with the key. That's when the scratching started. At first, it was faint, like nails running lightly across the back wall of the building. It grew louder, more insistent, moving closer to the door. I backed away, clutching the small metal baseball bat we kept under the counter. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it felt oppressive. And then, from somewhere inside the store, I heard a soft tapping. It came from the supply room in the back, a slow, deliberate knock that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't just ignore it. My steps were slow and cautious as I made my way to the back. The door to the supply room was ajar, swinging gently as though recently disturbed. I pushed it open with the bat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, or so I thought. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay another note, scrawled in crude, uneven letters. "I like watching you." My breath hitched as I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. I backed out slowly, locking the door behind me. That's when I noticed the lights flickering more violently than before, plunging the store into brief intervals of darkness. Each time the lights came back on, I swore the shadows shifted, growing darker and closer. Panic gripped me as I made my way back to the front, intent on grabbing my car keys and leaving, job be damned. But when I reached the counter, the keys were gone. Instead, there was a single Polaroid photograph, freshly developed, sitting in their place. It was a picture of me, taken from somewhere just outside the store, my face frozen in fear as I stared at the note in the supply room. My blood ran cold as I looked toward the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there with a camera. But the lot was empty, as desolate as ever. That's when the phone rang again. My hand hovered over the receiver, every instinct telling me not to answer, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up, and this time, the voice was clearer. "You can't leave." The line went dead, and the lights cut out completely, plunging the store into darkness. The next few moments were a blur of terror. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the thick shadows. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A flash of motion, a shape that didn't belong. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It darted between the aisles, faster than my light could follow. I ran for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Finally, it gave way, and I bolted into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the safety of my apartment, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breathing. But as I stepped out, I froze. There, on my apartment door, was another handprint, smeared and fresh, with a note taped beneath it. "We'll see you again soon." Working the graveyard shift at Hollow Point gas station was never a glamorous gig, but I liked the solitude. Most nights were quiet, just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional moth fluttering around the buzzing fluorescent lights. The station itself sat on a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by miles of flatlands and thick woods that seemed to close in around it after midnight. It was the kind of place where your imagination could run wild if you let it, but I'd always prided myself on keeping a level head. That was until the night when everything I thought I understood about reality unraveled into something I still can't explain. It started around 11:45 p.m., just as I was finishing restocking the snack aisle. I noticed a faint tapping sound, so light it was almost imperceptible, like fingertips brushing against glass. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the front doors, but when I walked over, There was nothing outside but the empty lot bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. Shrugging it off, I returned to my post behind the counter, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then the tapping came again, louder this time, deliberate and rhythmic. It wasn't coming from the doors. It was coming from the window in the back storage room. My stomach tightened as I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way through the narrow aisles, every creak of the floor echoing in the oppressive silence. The storage room was dark, the single bulb overhead flickering erratically as I stepped inside. The window was closed, and outside was nothing but an expanse of pitch-black woods. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, half expecting to see some animal or maybe a tree branch scraping against the glass. But there was nothing there. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. I locked the storage room window just in case and headed back to the counter, telling myself it was nothing. For a while, everything was calm again. The clock ticked past midnight, and I started to relax, convincing myself I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But then the phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the stillness, making me jump. The caller ID was blank, just a series of dashes where a number should have been. Hesitantly, I picked up the receiver. "Hollow Point gas station," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, there was silence on the other end, and then a low, raspy whisper. "Why didn't you check the door?" My blood ran cold as I hung up, my hand trembling. I spun around to look at the front doors, but they were still closed, the lot beyond them empty. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably a prank, maybe some bored kids messing with me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The unease that had been gnawing at me all night had now grown into full-blown dread. I was about to call my manager when I heard it again. The tapping, this time louder and coming from all around me. It was as if invisible fingers were drumming on the windows, the counters, even the shelves. I spun in every direction, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped as quickly as it started, leaving me standing in the middle of the store, heart pounding. That's when I saw it. On the security monitor, a single frame frozen in grainy black and white. The image of someone standing just outside the storage room window, their face pressed against the glass. They were gone by the time I turned around to look, but the image was seared into my brain. Their face was pale, featureless except for two deep black hollows where eyes should have been. Panicking, I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, but the line was dead. Every attempt to call out was met with static. Desperate, I bolted the front doors and hunkered down behind the counter, clutching a metal flashlight like a weapon. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, waiting for something, anything to happen. The security monitor flickered, and my blood turned to ice. On the screen, the figure was inside the store now, standing in the middle of the snack aisle, perfectly still. I looked up, expecting to see them there, but the aisle was empty. The monitor flickered again, and now the figure was closer, standing just a few feet from the counter. I refused to look up this time, my eyes glued to the screen. Then the lights in the station went out, plunging everything into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom as I scanned the store. It was empty, eerily silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The monitor flickered to life again, the figure now standing at the front doors, one hand pressed against the glass. This time, I forced myself to look up, and what I saw nearly made me drop the flashlight. There was nothing there. The lot outside was empty, the doors untouched. I was losing it, my grip on reality slipping away as the line between what was real and what wasn't blurred into nothingness. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. Grabbing my keys, I made a dash for the back door, praying it wasn't locked. As I reached for the handle, I felt it, a presence behind me, a cold, suffocating weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't turn around, couldn't. Instead, I threw the door open and ran as fast as I could into the night, the darkness swallowing me whole. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where a passing truck finally picked me up. When I told the driver what had happened, He just shook his head and muttered something about Hollow Point being cursed, about how the station had been abandoned for years after the previous attendant disappeared without a trace. I didn't argue. I didn't want to know. All I know is I'll never set foot in that place again. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone is still watching me. Working at the Crescent Ridge gas station wasn't something I chose out of passion or ambition. It was a last resort, a job to pay the bills and pass the time. The station sat on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by overgrown fields and a single narrow forest trail that disappeared into the darkness. Nights were long, quiet, and often uneventful, save for the occasional trucker or late-night traveler stopping for gas or snacks. But there was something about the isolation of this place that always felt off, as if the station itself existed in its own world, far removed from the safety of reality. That feeling intensified one Thursday night during the graveyard shift, a night that began like any other, but slowly unraveled into something I can't explain or forget. The clock above the counter read 12:37 a.m. when I first noticed it. An old, rusted sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the flickering neon lights. I hadn't seen it pull in, and there was no sign of anyone getting out. It just sat there, engine off, its darkened windows reflecting the gas pumps. At first, I thought maybe someone had broken down and was waiting for help. But as the minutes ticked by and no one approached the station, unease began to creep in. I tried to focus on my work, restocking the shelves and wiping down the counters, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I glanced out the window, the car was there, unmoving, a silent silhouette in the shadows. Around 1 a.m., my curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing across the empty lot. There was no response. The car remained still, its windows impenetrable in the darkness. I approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under my boots, and shined the flashlight into the driver's side window. The interior was empty, just a torn seat and a cracked dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition, but there was no sign of a driver. A chill ran down my spine as I backed away, my eyes scanning the surrounding fields and the edge of the forest for any sign of movement. Nothing. I returned to the station, locking the door behind me and trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. An hour passed, and the car hadn't moved. But then, at 2:12 a.m., the phone rang. The sound startled me, and I almost dropped the box of chips I was holding. The caller ID was blank. "Crescent Ridge gas station," I answered, my voice shaky. There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. "Hello," I said again, louder this time. The tapping stopped, and a low voice whispered, "Turn around." My heart stopped, and I froze, too scared to move. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the store was empty, the aisles silent and still. I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling, and locked myself in the back office. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, staring at the security monitors. Most of the cameras were static-filled and unreliable, but the one pointed at the lot showed the car. Only now, the driver's side door was open. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no movement, no sign of anyone near the car, but the door swayed gently in the breeze. I switched the monitor to the interior camera, scanning the aisles. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the frame, near the back of the store. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My breath quickened as I stared at the screen, willing the shadow to move, to reveal itself. But it didn't. Instead, the lights in the store flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. Panic set in as I grabbed my phone, the weak flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I made my way to the breaker box near the storage room, my heart pounding with every step. As I reached for the switch, I heard it, a faint, deliberate scraping sound coming from inside the storage room. It was slow, methodical, like someone dragging a sharp object across the floor. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. I fumbled with the breaker switch, the lights flickering back on with a loud hum. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned around, the storage room door was ajar, swinging gently. I should have left then and there, grabbed my keys and driven as far away as possible, but something compelled me to stay to find out what was happening. I pushed the door open with a trembling hand, revealing a room that appeared untouched. But in the center of the floor was a message, scrawled in what looked like oil. "I see you." My knees buckled as I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The overhead lights began to flicker again, casting erratic shadows across the room. One of them moved. My breath caught as I realized the shadow wasn't random. It was deliberate, shifting slowly toward me. I bolted, slamming the storage room door shut and locking it behind me. Back in the main area, I grabbed my car keys from under the counter and ran for the exit, only to stop dead in my tracks. The rusted sedan was gone. The lot was empty, the night eerily silent. My hands shook as I unlocked my car and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights, was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the glass, watching me. I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the lot and speeding down the highway, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The figure didn't follow, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. I don't know who or what was at the Crescent Ridge gas station that night, but I do know one thing: I'm never going back. Working at Willow Creek gas station on the night shift always had its eerie charm. The long, lonely hours punctuated by the occasional traveler or trucker made it a haven for anyone seeking solitude. The station was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, a single island of flickering fluorescent lights surrounded by a sea of dark, whispering pines. The air always carried a strange, electric charge, like the moments before a thunderstorm, but nothing could have prepared me for the night when everything changed, when the world around me seemed to unravel into something unrecognizable. It began with a phone call, the kind where you expect the line to be dead but instead hear breathing on the other end, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to someone just calling by mistake. I hung up, shaking off the unease, but the call came again 5 minutes later, then 10, then 15. Each time, the same ominous silence, punctuated by that breath. I checked the parking lot through the greasy glass of the front window, but there was no sign of life except for the dim headlights of a truck passing far off on the highway. Returning to my counter, I found a single piece of paper lying where there had been none before, a handwritten note in a sharp, jagged scrawl. "It watches." My blood turned cold. I didn't see anyone enter the store, and there was no way someone could have placed it there without me noticing. The phone rang again, this time echoing through the store like a scream in the night, and my hand shook as I picked it up. This time, there was a voice, low and gravelly, almost inaudible over the crackling static. "Don't look outside." Instinctively, I turned toward the window, but I couldn't see anything except my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. The phone line went dead, and I stood there, frozen, the paper in my hand feeling heavier than it should have. That's when the power flickered, plunging the store into a dim, emergency red glow. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam sweeping across the shelves, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to move on their own. I locked the doors, my pulse racing as I backed into the counter, trying to convince myself it was all just some elaborate prank. Then the tapping started. At first, it was faint, like the sound of someone gently rapping on the glass, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the store like a heartbeat. The windows remained empty, no figures, no movement, just the relentless noise. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it felt alive, pressing down on me. I thought about calling the police, but when I picked up the phone, the line was filled with more static, broken occasionally by faint whispers I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the security monitors in the corner flickered on, displaying a single distorted frame. A man in a hooded jacket standing by the fuel pumps. His head was bowed, hands stuffed into his pockets, his posture unnervingly still. I squinted at the screen, and for a moment, his face flickered into focus. No, not a face, just an empty void where one should have been. I blinked, and he was gone, replaced by an empty lot. I turned to the window again, but the lot was as lifeless as before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard the faint sound of footsteps, not from outside but from within the store itself. They were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth between the aisles. My flashlight cut through the shadows, but there was no one there, only the distant hum of the refrigerators. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started, and the oppressive silence returned. Then came the sound of the doorbell chiming, the kind that announced a customer entering the store. The locked doors stood firm, untouched, but the sound repeated, again and again, as if mocking me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on keeping myself together, but then the lights in the storage room flickered on, illuminating a shadow moving just beyond the cracked door. My heart pounded as I moved toward it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The door creaked open on its own, revealing rows of shelves stacked with cleaning supplies and boxes, and in the far corner, a mirror. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It stood tall and menacing, its surface rippling like water under the dim light. As I approached, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror wore my uniform, but their eyes were empty, their mouth twisted into a cruel grin. They raised a hand to the glass, pressing against it as if trying to push through. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and locking it. The tapping resumed, louder and more frantic, but this time, it was coming from every window, every wall, surrounding me in a cacophony of sound. I ran to the counter, grabbing the emergency phone, but the voice on the other end stopped me cold. "You should have stayed inside." The words sent a chill down my spine as the walls of the gas station seemed to close in, the lights flickering wildly. Outside, the lot was no longer empty. Shadowy figures stood motionless, staring at the building with faces obscured by the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but when I finally found the courage to look again, the figures were gone, and the gas station was silent once more. I bolted out the back door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap, and ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the side of the highway. The station was nowhere to be seen, the road stretching endlessly in both directions, as if the world itself had swallowed it whole. I flagged down a passing car, babbling about what had happened, but the driver only looked at me with pity, saying the station had been abandoned for years, a local legend about disappearances no one could explain. I've never gone back, but every now and then, I dream of that mirror, the grin, and the tapping that never stopped. I don't know why I chose to work the night shift at that gas station. It was in the middle of nowhere, a crumbling relic of a time when people actually stopped for gas and snacks on long trips. But by the time I needed a job, it was the only option left. The gas station sat at the intersection of two quiet highways, the kind of place people pass through without giving it a second thought. And yet, I found myself drawn to its eerie stillness every night. Started off like any other night shift. The hum of the fluorescent lights above, the flicker of the gas pumps outside, and the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. The station was mostly empty. The occasional car would pull in for a quick fill-up, and I'd see their faces, tired from the road, just long enough to exchange a few words, and then they were gone, disappearing into the night as if they never existed. But after the clock struck midnight, things began to feel different. It was subtle at first, a whisper of wind against the windows that I could have sworn wasn't there before, the faint sound of footsteps in the gravel outside, too slow, too deliberate to be anyone just passing through. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the wind or the groan of the old pipes in the walls. But then the tapping began. At first, it was just light, almost imperceptible, like someone gently rapping on the glass. I didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just a branch brushing against the window. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from the door. I stood frozen, staring at the door as the sound continued, faster now, like someone was knocking frantically to get in. My heart began to race as I walked cautiously toward the door, peering through the glass, but no one was there. I checked the parking lot again, but it was empty, save for the faint outline of the pumps illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the stress of the long shifts getting to me. But the tapping didn't stop. Continued, louder, more urgent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked back to the counter, my fingers trembling as I picked up the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. I slammed the receiver down, my mind racing, and the doorbell chimed. That same eerie, mechanical sound that echoed through the store like an omen. But there was no one there, and the bell kept ringing over and over as if mocking me. That's when I noticed something strange. A piece of paper had appeared on the counter. It wasn't there a second ago, but now it sat in front of me, its edges torn, the paper yellow and brittle as if it had been lying there for years. The handwriting was jagged, unsteady. "Leave now." I froze, my blood running cold. There was no way anyone had been in here, and yet, there it was. I backed away from the counter, looking around the store, but nothing had changed. The shelves stood where they always had, the lights flickered occasionally, but there was no one, nothing out of the ordinary. I thought I could hear the faint sound of breathing, heavy, labored, like someone was standing right behind me. But when I turned, the room was empty. I was alone, or so I thought. I tried to shake off the panic, telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd been working too many hours without a break. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like someone was watching me from just out of sight. I checked the security cameras, scanning through the feed, but there was nothing unusual. The parking lot was still empty, the pumps still silent. That's when I noticed something in the corner of the screen. A shadow, just barely visible, moving behind the pump. My heart stopped. There was no one there, I was sure of it. But the shadow moved again, slow, deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly switched the camera feed to another angle, but there was nothing. The shadow was gone. Panic flooded my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, my only source of comfort in the dark, and walked toward the back door. As I reached for the handle, I heard the tapping again, louder than ever, like nails scraping against the glass, coming from the window behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something unseen was tightening its grip around me, and I couldn't breathe. I ran back to the front counter, my hands shaking as I tried the phone again, but the line was still dead. The lights flickered one last time, and then everything went dark. For a moment, there was complete silence, and I just stood there, the only sound my racing heartbeat in my ears. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the back of the store. I could feel them getting closer, each step making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But when I turned, there was no one there. The footsteps stopped, but the presence, the feeling of being watched, was stronger than ever. I could feel them just behind me, breathing heavily. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and turned to face the front door. The parking lot was empty, but the reflection in the glass caught my eye. In the darkness, I saw a figure standing just outside the door, its face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there, standing still, watching me. My body froze in terror. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching. Then, it slowly turned and disappeared into the night. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out or fallen asleep, but when I woke up, The sun was rising, and the gas station was quiet. Everything was back to normal, but I knew it wasn't over. The shadows were still there, watching, waiting, and I couldn't escape them. They would always be there, lurking just out of sight, in the corners of the gas station, waiting for the next person to fall into their trap. And every night, I waited for them to return, knowing that sooner or later, they would. Started like any other night shift at the gas station. The kind of shift where time drags on endlessly, and you find yourself staring at the clock more than you'd like to admit. The gas station was in a desolate area, surrounded by miles of empty road, long stretches of nothing but dark woods, and the occasional passing truck or car. I had gotten used to the eerie silence that fell over the place after hours, the only sounds being the distant hum of the pumps and the occasional breeze rustling the dried leaves around the parking lot. I worked alone most nights, just me, the quiet station, and the deep, heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I had worked here for months, but there was always something unsettling about the place. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle with unease, even when I tried to push it out of my mind. Tonight, it felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, the creeping sense of loneliness that came from working in a place so far from civilization, but the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, creeping into my thoughts like a shadow that I couldn't quite get rid of. I shook it off, tried to focus on the task at hand, and started cleaning up the counter, my mind drifting back to the hum of the fluorescent lights above. That was when I heard it, an odd scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other animal rummaging around outside, but it was different. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was slowly dragging their feet across the gravel. I looked out the window, expecting to see a car pulling in or a customer walking to the door, but there was nothing. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights casting long, empty shadows on the cracked pavement. I was alone. I went back to my cleaning, but the sound kept going closer now, too close. It was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from behind the counter and walked slowly toward the back door, my heart thumping in my chest. I was half expecting to open the door and find a customer who had wandered into the night, but there was no one. The air was cold, and the gravel crunched beneath my boots as I stepped outside, scanning the area with the beam of the flashlight. Nothing. The night was eerily still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the trees. I was about to go back inside when I felt it, a cold, pricking sensation on the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the lot, but there was nothing, no one. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind or my nerves getting the best of me. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like someone was standing just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, watching. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence around me, then turned and walked back into the station, locking the door behind me. As soon as I was inside, the scraping sound started again. But this time it was louder, closer, like something was dragging its feet along the side of the building. I froze, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only the deafening silence. Then, a soft tapping. The sound was faint at first, like someone gently knocking on the window. It was rhythmic, steady, and I could feel it reverberating in my chest. I glanced toward the window, but I didn't see anything. No one was standing outside, no shadow shifting in the dark. It was as if the tapping was coming from nowhere, just lingering in the air, filling the space with an unsettling sense of dread. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. I knew I had to check the security cameras, make sure nothing unusual was happening outside. But when I looked at the screen, everything seemed normal. Empty parking lot, no cars, no movement. The only thing out of place was a small, dark shape flickering in the corner of the camera feed. I stared at it, my heart beginning to race as the shape moved, just a shadow, but it was there. It was real. It was as if someone or something was standing just beyond the frame, just out of view. I turned away from the screen, trying to calm my breathing, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. It was as if the entire station was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The tapping continued, growing louder, faster, until it was almost frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check again, make sure I wasn't just imagining things. I turned toward the window, and that's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, a brief flash in the dark. A figure, but it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape distorted in the dim light. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was dragging itself across the ground. It moved so slowly, but it was getting closer, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the terror that gripped me. The figure stepped into the light, and I could see it more clearly now. It was wrong. His body was a twisted, unnatural shape, like something that didn't belong in this world. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. Its eyes were dark pits, empty voids that seemed to pull me in, drawing me toward them. And its hands, they were long, too long fingers ending in sharp, gnarled nails that scraped against the window as it reached for me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching me, its presence suffocating the air around me. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare. I didn't know how long I stood there, but the moment seemed to stretch on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. The tapping stopped. The scraping sound was gone. Everything was silent again. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, but when I finally gathered enough courage to look outside, there was nothing. No trace of the creature. No sign of anything unusual. I've never worked a night shift at that station again. Every night, I can still feel that cold presence, that watchful gaze, following me, even though I'm miles away from that place now. But sometimes, late at night, I can hear that tapping again, distant but unmistakable, scratching at the edges of my mind. And I know it's waiting, out there in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, always watching.